This is Nanoscale. I'm Seth Zimmerman.
And I'm Erin Spain.
On this show, we venture into the frontier of nanotechnology.
With experts in the field who are turning the science of small into the next industrial revolution.
This podcast is brought to you by the International Institute for Nanotechnology at Northwestern University.
We have brewed up an episode for you today that is steeping in scientific curiosity.
That's right. In the debate of tea versus coffee, there is now a clear winner.
Okay, spill it, Seth.
Okay, so not only is tea the most widely consumed beverage globally, today's guest, Dr. Vinayak Dravid, has discovered that brewed tea leaves can actually pull toxic metals like lead and chromium out of water.
Okay, coffee cannot do that.
It cannot. So we are going to dig into this finding, which could position tea as a low-cost way to massively contribute to reduced heavy metal exposure in populations worldwide, and find out more ways Dr. Dravid is leveraging nature's chemistry and nanotechnology to help solve pressing global problems.
Dr. Dravid is the Abraham Harris Professor of Materials Science and Engineering and founding director of Northwestern University Atomic and Nanoscale Characterization Center. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So first off, I have to know, are you a coffee or a tea drinker? Before your research, where were you and where are you now?
So how about this? I was born and brought up in India, which is a tea country. So I started with tea, but I transitioned back to coffee. And I do both now, coffee and tea. And the funny part about coffee and tea, different with respect to what you just mentioned, is coffee becomes part of the beverage itself that gets consumed. Tea is the only beverage where the leaves or the content remain behind and you drink only the dissolved part. And that is very interesting underpinning, as we'll discuss later.
So what motivated you and your team to investigate tea as a potential material for heavy metal remediation in water?
I had a fantastic student and a subgroup in environmental remediation area. And so we have very periodic meeting, we brainstorm. And in one of the meetings, one of the approaches that we use are called pouch approaches. So the idea is that if you have a contaminated water that is sedentary in a pond or a reservoir, one of the ways we try to sequester or remove the toxins is to put pouches, and then the pouches have the sponge-based material which absorb the pollutant. And someone in the subgroup meeting, I mentioned, hey, that looked just like tea bags being put in a cup. And then Ben is a tea lover. And so one thing led to another, and he really felt curious. And he says that most of the time, and in fact, that's something I suggested to him, that we tend to think of tea as something that releases flavor and the content, but we never think of what it would absorb. So we said, okay, Ben, you're a tea lover. You want to try this out? And he picked it up as a project, as a fun project to see whether tea can do anything else. And so one of the things we started off with is lead, because lead is such a common pollutant, contaminant. In fact, just last year, there was a very big report in Guardian where they did the study in the Chicago south side to really show that a lot of the households were contaminated by lead. And so that's where we led to this idea that, let's try and see if lead, and so then we tried different elements, so different metals, toxic element, cadmium, and so forth. And then what turned out to be a sort of a fun project just to see had this profound implication in the following way. Little did we know at the time that this has implication to billions of people. So there are roughly about 4 billion cups of tea consumed on a daily basis. Can you imagine any research which can potentially impact 4 billion people or 4 billion cups of tea? So it was very overwhelming at one point, saying, whoa. At the same time, it also taught us many teachable moments. And one of the ones which I really relish is this idea that if there's a contaminated water, you don't have to clean that whole thing as long as you clean the water that you drink. And so just the cup in your hand is the most important water that needs to be clean. And so this led to a lot of interesting paradigms, I feel, in this arena. One is that, cleaning one cup at a time is a great paradigm instead of cleaning the whole. So challenge, of course, deployment is such a complicated thing. So to be able to clean up a whole lake is far more challenging than, cleaning a cup of water, right? So that's one thing. Secondly, this action is so simple. You take a tea bag, you dip it in a warm water for 1 or 2 minutes. So this is not complicated. Anybody can do it. So environmental challenges are at that scale that you need solution which has to be very simple, very easy to deploy. And one of my favorite quotes the last few years is perfection is the enemy of good enough, because nobody is looking for 100%. All we're doing is accumulation of positive merits that will get to quality of life. And in some ways, even a teacup can sequester just a 10-15% of contaminant that we deliberately added, really showed that it has global health implications. And one last point I'll make is something we didn't anticipate when this work came out is that there are cultural norms and mores like tea drinking. There are many parts of the world where, food is consumed or drinks consumed as a part of some cultural norms. And tea is that spirit. Like there are billions of people drink tea. And so in some ways, if there are regions of the world where there are pollution contaminants, but there are norms of the society to have, say, tea consumption, there might be a dial to understand global health based on a simple thing as tea brewing. And that part we were not aware of. And so this study, which started as a fun study to see curiosity, seemed to have touched a lot of nerves, and we're very excited by that.
And you confirmed that it's not only the tea bag doing the work, it's the tea and the tea bag.
Both. It turns out part of the other motivation for us was there is scientific, I wouldn't say misinformation, the lack of information about the different things that happen in a tea bag. Right? If you have a tea bag can be made of plastic, then they would lead to microplastic release. So there was actually a big report in New York Times about the tea bag releasing microplastic. And what we showed is that if the tea bags are made with polypropylene or some of the nylon, then of course you will get some microplastic. But if they're made of cellulose, they're actually biodegradable and they do not release any microplastic. And that was also another finding that of our work was it's not just the tea bag, the content, the reservoir, the pouch in which the tea resides is equally important because that needs to be also biodegradable and it should not interfere with the tea performance itself.
Finding inventive ways of cleaning contaminated water has long been part of your focus here at Northwestern. So we're going to dig into some of those projects a bit more during this episode. But first, tell us a bit about your path to science and nanotechnology, and why are you interested in using nanoscale solutions to solve these big challenges of energy and environment and sustainability?
Some years ago, we always do basic science, right? The part of the reason we join academia is to search for the fundamental processes, phenomena that underpin the life as we know, the world as we know it. And so we've always been interested in fundamental issues. But about 2010 or so, that's when there's a deep water horizon. If you remember, there's a big accident in the Gulf of Mexico that released billions of gallons of oil and gas, and there's ecosystem damage. And one of my friend at that time ran ARPA-E, and he was part of the team with Steve Chu and Obama team at the time who tried to mitigate this problem. And that's when, he's a good friend. So we shared a lot of insights as to the level of challenges this type of accidents pose. So whether it's energy, as in this case of oil and gas, form of energy, of environment, these are absolutely large scale problems. And particularly in the Western world for the last 2.5 centuries of industrialization has this legacy of air pollution, water pollution, and general sand and soil pollution going on. So when we saw the scale and the scope of the problem, it's very overwhelming and one could just simply give up, right? The scale of the problem is such. But at the same time, as nanotechnologies, we know that some of the solutions to some of the larger problems tend to be at the smaller scale. So human genome showed that there are certain traits of humans are governed by the DNA sequence, right? And DNA is truly a nanoscale object. So here is the sort of a paradigm in biology that you have a form-function relationship. So given the form of a molecule, it can be predicted to see how it would behave. And that sort of a paradigm is also there in physical science called a structure-property relationship, where given the structure, what would be the consequence of the structure in terms of its end use? And so that sort of reinforced this idea that you find in nature. So, for example, a gecko sticks so well to the surfaces because each gecko has individual bonds, which are very weak. But when you have zillions of bonds, it's like a post-it note. So we want a solution like a post-it note where we want it to stick and then we want to remove it. And the reason being, then we can reuse the same thing again and again. And that would reduce the need for inventory. That would reduce the waste. Because nowadays the paradigm is that the waste is a very big deal because oil waste or phosphate or metal and so forth. So coming back full circle, what we felt that it is not only important to basic science, but also look at the basic science and translate this into applied technology. So for the last few years, we are now studying what we call is a nanoscale solution to gigaton problem, where we look at what are the scientific technical underpinning at the scale of nanoscale, which can then be scaled up in terms of deployment using substrate material which are readily available, such as sponges.
The OHM sponge is one of your best known innovations. It's a highly porous, smart sponge that selectively soaks up oil and water and was developed as an oil spill remediation platform. Tell us about this discovery.
Sponges and foams, when you get your gift in December, you pull out your iPhone, and what do you do the rest of it? You throw it away, and that ends up going into landfill. So just polyurethane alone, which is the foam, 8 odd million tons of polyurethane goes into landfill every year. So you can imagine over the last many decades, there's been billions of tons of waste, and that is rotting in the landfill. Instead, what we do is called the story of R, the letter R. So we take the sponge and repurpose it. So repurpose means it acts as a sorbent to absorb the bad stuff. And sponges are great at absorbing fluid, but they're not very good at selective absorption. So when you have an oil and water mixture, we just want the oil to come in and water to leave behind. So our nanotechnology solution is a coating that attracts only oil and not water. So when you absorb it, you get only a large amount of oil. So sponges are the extremely good substrate on which we can coat because they're usually discarded. So we are instead of wasting it, we are repurposing it. So that's the first R. Second, we use a coating. So we don't have a monolithic material with large amounts. We just 5% of the coating. So we always reduce. That's our second R is the reduce. So we don't use the whole thing, but use only, it's like a paint on the wall. You're connected only to the wall paint. What's underneath, unless there's some structural integrity, it's just the surface you interact with. So having a reduction in amount so that we have a coating gives us the second R. The third is we absorb the pollutant. And so in the case of oil, we squeeze and oil comes out. And then when you do this repeatedly, and at some point the sponge starts to break up. So imagine you are recovering the resource and reusing it repeatedly for many, many times. And when it starts to fall apart, you can have incineration to provide heat. And the ash that is created actually would also be valued because that's graphitic ash that can go into batteries. And so you have a complete life cycle of the sponge. So we have moved this sponge from millions of tons in the wasteland. We pulled them out, we made them smart and magical so that they can absorb oil and phosphate and many other pollutants. So you have resource recovery, you have reduced waste, you have reduced inventory. And the last R I'll leave it is we restore the environment.
What has the reaction been from the community? Not only folks who are interested in oil spill remediation, but just the general public. What do people think about this magical sponge?
We're very excited to share. So I've been using this as an example from one of my favorite characters is SpongeBob. And so you can imagine there's a lot of affinity for SpongeBob. And so if SpongeBob is smart enough to now start sequestering oil and phosphate and metal, is no longer just cuddly and lovable, but is actually very effective and useful. So I've had TED Talk, I've been to a Rotary Club. So we do a lot of societal outreach. And, Seth knows that I run a center which does a lot of outreach to community at large. And the main story is for hundreds plus years, this, oil, water in the environment, pollution is a very long problem going back hundreds of years. The technologies are very old, a lot of incumbent, and this is the scale, which is gigaton manufacturing, is so complex that very few people want to change. And so to make that change requires that you have to be so good. So I'll give an example. Typical oil and water separation, they use material called polypropylene. It barely has the capacity one time its own weight, and typically you cannot reuse it. So it's like diapers. Have you ever seen diaper being reused, right?
Not successfully.
It's a waste. So imagine now our sponge absorb 25 to 30 times its own weight of oil. You squeeze it, repeat it many times. So you're almost 1,000 times better than out there. So if I have one time, two times, if I'm 10%, 20%, it's not going to, but when you have 1,000 times, people are going to take a pause
Right.
and say, whoa, now let's take a pause. So we're looking at two approaches. One is even if we use it once, it is so good. It's faster, better, cheaper. I always say, but other than that, it's just like anything else. But if you decide to reuse it, you're going to get 1,000 times the value. So you're getting two types of people. There are innovators, right? There's always somebody who wants to do something different where they want to say, whoa, instead of having 1,000 pads which I have to get rid of, what if I get this one pad and have a bucket where I can use the oil and then sell the oil? Then you can have both resource recovery, reuse, reduce weight, inventory, and everybody's happy. And that is the main paradigm. That in the past, people used to say environment cleanup, oh, expensive, it's too cumbersome, oh, it's going to take forever, so let's not do it. But now there's no excuse. So in fact, I'm invited to the Great Lakes legislative session in mid-June to talk about Great Lakes. We have this amazing resource, but it doesn't take much to contaminate. 1,100 ppm of oil makes that barrel of water completely poisonous. So imagine we have beautiful resource here. All it takes, phosphate, metals, minor amount, and we lost that resource. And we have only there's 1% of fresh water on earth. And so you can imagine how precious that resource is. So we need technologies which are scalable and deployable with very easy to use. So I call it the ease. It has to be effective, it has to be efficient, but it has to be ergonomic. That means you don't want anything complicated. And last, it has to be economic. And that is the main message in this business. And that's what nano brings. You have small things making a big difference. The same amount of material with large surface area has a very high capacity. And that's our innovation for which just a couple of weeks ago received the patent is approved by the USPTO. It is fully approved in many parts of the world where potential manufacturing could take place in addition to India. And then we have second patent for which we have office action that looks very favorable for phosphate and metal removal. So we feel excited that we have this amazing platform, sponge, which is widely available, otherwise get discarded. So it's almost like when I first came to America, I had this late night infomercials, right? You order now, you're going to get this.
I mean, it does almost sound too good to be
It is true,
true.
exactly. And
Right.
that's why I often say that, if you order now, not only will remove your oil, but will recover it 20 times. But wait, if you order now, we can remove phosphate and then reuse it for fertilizer. So in some ways, I'm tongue in cheek, but at the same time, it is absolutely serious and sincere because it's a startup company which has the ambition to take this to a next level, manufacture and clean up the whole world.
Your team is also developing the Pearl Media, which is a nanocomposite and similar platform technology to the OHM sponge. However, the Pearl Media is specifically tailored for phosphate pollution remediation. So tell us a bit more about that.
So remember, our idea is we use widely available substrates such as sponge. So in the first case of oil and water is a polyurethane, polymeric sponge, which is usually doesn't like water anyway, but our coating makes it very attractive for oil. So that's called an OHM sponge. That was the first innovation. What Sid mentioned is Pearl. Pearl is phosphate elimination and recovery and very lightweight. And that's called the Pearl acronym. And there it's to absorb dissolved phosphate, which is a part of the runoff from agriculture. Especially in the Midwest, in the Great Lakes area, we have a lot of agriculture. So what happens? You have rain and other waterways. The fertilizer that is fed into the agriculture gets run off, nitrogen and phosphorus. To some extent, nitrogen is lucky because nitrogen has a gas. So there is a nitrogen cycle that we study in middle school, right? But phosphorus does not have a gas. So phosphorus is a non-renewable, limited resource. Much of it used to come at the border between Ukraine and Russia, and you can imagine what's happening to that. There's a tremendous shortage of phosphate in the world. Agriculture that fed into North Africa and many parts of the Middle East come for phosphate from that part of the world. So it's a non-renewable resource, which is very challenging. And so to be able to recover phosphate and reuse it, which has tremendous implication. Within our Great Lakes, part of the challenge with phosphate leads to algae bloom because it's a nutrient for a lot of planktons and they eat it and then the bacteria come and they digest the plankton and that leads to eutrophication, absorption of. So you see the satellite picture of the green algae bloom in different parts of the country are just not only ugly, but they really lead to ecosystem destruction. What we want to do is to be able to capture the phosphate before it goes into water. So somebody mentioned yesterday, for example, that our Lake Michigan looks so beautiful turquoise blue. I said it might look good. That's good color for Caribbean, but not a good color for Midwest. We need more green. We need a little more life in that lake. And that's a challenge right now with Lake Michigan. So in our sustainable approach using sponge, we're looking for methods by which we can implement the cleanup very effective, very easily, ergonomically. It's called drop-in technology. So in the case of oil and water, it's very simple. Our coating makes the sponge allow only oil to absorb. So that's very easy. And you squeeze the oil literally, and you have a bucket of oil you keep on. And we have less than 5% of water. So in fact, the company did some pilots in the Antwerp, the largest port in Europe, and they actually simulated a spill and they had very impressive results. So there, the issue is very simple. You absorb the oil, you recover by just squeezing it. Phosphate, we showed that pH, the acidity of the water, is a big determinant to absorb and dissolve. So that's a very easy, wastewater management, adjusting pH or so-called acidity of the water is a very easy administrative thing to do. You don't want to do add many things or subtract, but adding acid or base to change the pH is a simple technical term. is very easy for most people to understand. So it turns out that we showed that low pH, which is more acidic environment, you can absorb a lot of phosphate, almost 90+% of phosphate in water would get absorbed to our pearl media. And that high pH, you release it. So it's very similar to oil water where you squeeze the oil out. Here we change the pH, release the phosphorus, and then you can reuse and absorb. So you have absorb, release, absorb cycle you can do. So you can create a concentrated phosphate solution that can be used as a feedstock for precursor. But at the minimum, you remove the phosphate from the water so that does not lead to downstream problems of eutrophication and algal bloom. And so here the pH is the trick. It turns out the Midwest waters are heavily contaminated with copper and zinc. And very easy to know why, because we had smelting, the zinc coating and smelting for a couple of 100 years in the vicinity of Lake Michigan, Gary, Indiana, and so forth. So a lot of our aquifers are understandably have some amounts of copper zinc. It turns out that copper zinc gets released at different pH. So my student recently showed that at some pH, you get the metal out. At higher pH, you get the phosphate out separately. So you have the ability to absorb both of them, but separate them separately. So you get copper and zinc separately and phosphate separately. And then you can use that copper and zinc solution and use it for other purposes. So this is very exciting. It's no longer just about cleaning the water, but absorbing the resource and recovering the resource. And that is truly the definition of sustainability, that we are taking this resource. It's like catalyst. It doesn't participate in the reaction, but it provides value-added product on the other side. So we feel that our sponge is truly that magic resource that it keeps on absorbing. It does all the things that it wants to do repeatedly, and we think is a sustainable solution. But I come full circle because we understand why it works based on nanoscale phenomena. And that is really the underpinning, that we understood why and how it works, that allows us to take that and anchor it on a substrate or a technology that is scalable. So the active element is on nano, but the deployment is readily available, cheap, easy to discard, easy to use.
You are passionate about water.
There's a personal reason, because I grew up in India and very limited resource. My own children probably won't believe me when I say that there were times where we would go kilometers with bucket of water to get water, especially in weddings in rural areas. It was impossible. There used to be a truck coming with water. India in those times in 70s, 80s was devastated, a lot of droughts. So it's very personal in a sense that, and we knew that, even if it's a puddle of water, a small contaminant would render it useless for consumption. So this is one of those problems that has been on our heart for a long time. And when we are here with Great Lakes, it's so easy to just take that for granted, but it doesn't take much to contaminate the lake with all sorts of poison that's out there.
Well, you are actually a little magical in another way because you've made water appear out of thin air. Meaning you've actually visualized hydrogen and oxygen forming nanobubbles of water in real time. This was a new discovery. Tell me about this.
That's an exciting discovery. So you can imagine, as I was saying, that we want to solve large problems like environment, energy, sustainability, but we want to solve them by truly understanding the basic science as to why it happened, how it happens, how do we leverage that so we can scale it up. And so as a part of that, we want to understand nanoscale phenomena, and we have developed a very innovative ways to understand them. So we created micro laboratory. So you have seen the research lab, the people with different instruments, different things going from one place to another. Imagine if you can miniaturize catalysis at the scale that goes into an electron microscope. So we have developed a very innovative chip that goes, so think of this as a total experiment that goes inside the electron microscope. While the experiment is taking place, we can watch what happens. You can have what we watch, the electron, to contribute to the reaction that happens. And many times we don't want that, so we can have it blind and watch the reaction afterwards. So one of our invention was this chip to be able to study nanoscale phenomena. As a part of that, one idea we had was when we go to Mars or many other parts of the space, there's no way we're going to carry the water that we need. But you can carry gases. You can carry compressed gases of very high volume. And there are parts of the extraterrestrial world, they might have access to gases like hydrogen, and you just take oxygen with you.
Do you believe this technology could really help humanity survive in outer space or other planets like Mars?
So one of my favorite movies is Martian. There are two technologies which really make that movie favorite of mine. One is he takes the thermoelectric heater, thermoelectric generator running around. In thermoelectric generator has a radioactive source which emits, so it becomes very hot on one end and there's a cool on the other hand. So that hot to cool can be converted into electricity. And that's one technology he showed. But the other side, he used jet fuel to create water, and there's agriculture on Mars by generating water. And we always were enamored by that thought. And I said, geez, can we now use catalysis to generate water on Mars or some other place where you have only gases available? So we did that experiment. Turns out that palladium is an excellent catalyst for water formation. It has been known for a long time, but nobody had observed that phenomena at the nanoscale. So what we did was we patterned nanoparticles of palladium. We introduced hydrogen in our chip, which is what makes this possible. So there are multiple innovations that had to work, just like any SpaceX flight or anything. Everything has to work for that success to occur. So the chip was a platform in which we did this experiment. We have palladium. Hydrogen goes in, it forms palladium hydride, which is very well known. Then we introduce oxygen, and then it catalyzes to form water. And you see the small bubble formation that grows up. We can monitor the kinetics, the thermodynamics. So there are many fundamental parameters we can measure for the first time. And what it showed is that not just the presence of three ingredients. It's like chef. You say, oh, all you did is mix up 7 different ingredients. And no, you have to do it in a proper sequence. You curate them. And that's what we showed, that if you introduce just hydrogen and water, nothing happens. Only when you first do hydrogen, then oxygen, then you found the water. And so that gave us a lot of insight that it's not just the number of constituents that are important, but the sequence, the dosing. And those are the insight that will be hopefully expanded in the future. So in the future, perhaps this approach could be used on Mars to generate water without consuming the catalyst, which is palladium, and you can keep on using the gas to produce water. So that was one other thought. But more importantly, it also provides insight as to how mechanisms work. And so we always come back to basic science.
So, your team really draws on inspiration from many different fields. You just mentioned Hollywood, astronomy, art. Tell me about these different disciplines and what they bring to your science.
It's a great question. And in fact, one of my favorite photos that I show is the field of view by the Hubble telescope and now the James Webb telescope. And there's a very classic picture which shows. So, what we see obviously with Hubble telescope is a nice visible view of the world. The other James Webb telescope a couple of years ago was launched. The same field of view, you see more and different. And so that's the thing. So imaging really brings, a lot of unknowns. So I often say, if I can't see, I don't understand. That has been the mantra for me all along. We need to be able to communicate science to masses, public. And now in the last 10 years, we have launched a program called nanojournalism, where the journalism students immerse in Nuance Center and watch how creativity works. Science is very complicated these days, but doesn't need to be. So that was one example where journalism brought in the perspective of storytelling. How do you tell stories? So communication is very important in my group, as Seth knows. It's not just about talking to each other, but how do you take complex idea and make it simplified? Science ultimately is about serving society. And so we are a very complex society. We want perspective. We want the benefit to be accrued by masses. And so that's the sort of reason why multidisciplinary, and there's always a reason why. So one of our recent invention is HIV sensing using a device which gives the signal in less than 2 minutes. It is potentially very easy, deployable, potentially point of care. And why I tell you this, that much of biomedical, you would think, is driven by advances within the field, which of course is true. But they're also influenced by cultural mores and norms. And especially in Africa, there are parts of the world, HIV is still a taboo. And to be able to be seen going into a clinic that serves HIV is a taboo. A lot of people may not do that. So here we are looking for innovation that would overcome that barrier. And so when we had some program in certain parts of the country, it really provides a lot of insight as to how demographics respond to various issues. And so that's another perspective we bring in. And lastly, take imaging as an example. That's my core field. I often say it's from atoms to animals and from arts to astronomy. So all of them encompass imaging in a very broad sense. So in arts, my first article was Odilon Reda of Prince of Dream. It's a book that Harriet Stratus curated from Art Institute. We looked at his paintings with electron microscope and other spectrometer to find out what they're made of and so forth, so we could preserve them better. So here is the situation where we looked at the arts. By the same time, in 9th of October, the 10-9, the Nano Day, we have an image contest at Nuance Center where artistic images that reflect the seas and some other vision people have. So there's an arts that is being investigated by science, as I mentioned to Odile Loredan, or the microscopy that we do is interpreted as arts. So there is this sort of a perspective. And astronomy is about looking at gazing the sky, looking at very tiny dots. So they do a lot of signal to noise processing. They have detectors, which are fantastic. So we learn from it. And so you have this complete continuum from atoms to astronomy going through animals and along the way. And imaging sort of ties a lot of these things together. So that underscores the multidisciplinary nature of innovation, research. And so nowadays we no longer worry, am I a material scientist? Am I a chemist? We look at a problem from all angles. So just 100+ years ago, there were no disciplines, right? They were natural sciences, right? They were called because the idea was look at nature and try to understand it, and maybe in some cases mimic it or not mimic it.
The nuance photo competition is one of my favorite events of the year. I'm always so excited to see that. And it's so cool, some of the images you see. And I think it's interesting because this intersection of all these other fields, it's so well displayed in this photo contest. And I'm curious, so now you can throw in artificial intelligence into the mix. So how do you see the future of these intersections evolving? And is there one area that you think will really change the game?
So we're always looking for what are the better ways to do science research as things are moving on. And this artificial machine learning has so many multiple attributes, but I'll just give you three buckets where it makes, at least in our case, makes sense. So let me give you a little bit of backdrop. So right now, one way of looking at societal evolution, we often bias ourselves to is how materials evolved, right? So we had Stone Age, then we have Bronze Age, then we call it Iron Age, and then we have Silicon Age of last century. And as you can imagine, as materials become complicated, now we have potential for transition of energy which requires catalysis. And most of the catalysis, which is value added, which is what we need, is driven by very precious metals. And now, there's so much controversy going on with especially minerals, issues associated with China holding 90% of the rare earth market. So we are looking for new materials which can be discovered at a pace which has never been seen before. So in that context, AI ML comes in three buckets for us. One is we want to be able to acquire data extremely fast. So when I see you both very charming, good looking, I know who you are. And when I see you at night with less than 90% light, I still would recognize you because our brain has that ability to recognize pattern. And so we want to bring that insight into data acquisition. So one of my colleagues said, no, Chad Merkin and his group, we collaborate together to make, say, nanoparticle. We can make 100 million nanoparticle in one afternoon. Our student jointly, who just recently finished a PhD, where she does that in one afternoon. But we don't have the ability to examine this 100 million particle. What we want to be able to do is intelligent decision making as to which data to acquire. So one bucket of AI ML is data acquisition, where we have smartness included in it. In fact, one of my first students who did this work was well before when AI ML was fashionable. So almost 8 years ago, he had the seminal paper on adaptive sampling, where he showed algorithm where you can scan 90% less in the area and still get fidelity of information. So that's called a sparse imaging. So with little light, you can still make sense out of it. So think of this as sort of a one bucket where we acquire data intelligently using AI ML approaches. Second is we are now creating so much data, both in spatial form, in the form of encoded spatially as nanoparticle or microstructure, we call it, or in a time domain, because we study phenomena as they happen. Watching paint dry, you might think is very boring, but absolutely not. At the nanoscale, it's the most fascinating thing to see how bonds are forming. So we are now creating terabytes of data in an afternoon. We have no way right now easily to manipulate, curate that data. So second AI ML approach we have is for data curation, archiving. How do we sort of make sure that it's findable, it's fair data, is findable, accessible, interoperable, etc., and repeatable. So that's the second bucket of AI ML. And the third, the most exciting one is data analytics. We want to send a bot into time domain to see sometime what happens, 5 minutes, nothing happened, 5 seconds, all hell breaks loose, and then 5 minutes, nothing happened. So how do you capture that information of 5 seconds that you don't want to miss? It's almost like when someone walks in, the light turns on because your motion sensor, and then the person goes away, time's off. So can we do that in data analytic in our experimental work? So these are three areas where AI ML is now really championing. And last thing we want to do is take multiple data, as say Google's and others do in terms of traffic, for example, but bring it in our research infrastructure. So And lastly, with teaching, so we want the immersion learning. So AI ML as a way to really improve our immersion learning and capacity to learn in the next generation.
Well, there's so much going on right now. You've mentioned all these projects just in the last 5 years that have come out of your lab. What can we expect in the next 5 years to come, not only from your lab, but for nanotechnology in general?
So some things are predictable. Things of AI ML will continue to grow. There are certain innovations which are linear in nature, but there are always going to be some non-linear which we don't know. And that's one of the beauty of being in an academia. We have students who want to change the world. They're not yet corrupted as we are. And I teach a freshman course, which I enjoy because these are fresh out of high school. And to see them, and I teach the same course many times, but every time there's always one or two students, they ask some question that stomp you, and then you realize that there's more to it. So I think there will be some continued development, but there'll be a lot of surprises. As far as my research grew, we have this theme called Nanoscale solution to Gigaton problem. So as you notice, oil and phosphate is how we started, but now we want to get into microplastic, PFAS. That's something we have some exciting development there that I will keep right now in suspense until we do it next time. There'll be press release, etc. And so we want to go to multiple pollutants and sequestration, resource recovery, sustainable solution. I think those are areas worth continuing.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for sharing what's happening in your lab and all the exciting work that's been taking place here at Northwestern. We appreciate your time.
Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you both. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening. This podcast is brought to you by the International Institute for Nanotechnology at Northwestern University. Be sure to follow this show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to give us a 5-star review.
For more information about IIN, go to our website, iinano.org/podcast.